Yeah, I'm working on a new book on apathy in today's times. It's kind of a continuation of my last book, Passion for Ignorance, because I see more and more people closing themselves into their private lives, switching off from the news, especially, the kind of traumatic news related to current political battles. Also, the war in Ukraine, even, among Russians, from Russian press, we can see that a lot of people inside Russia are switching off. They don't want to follow anymore. Of course, we have seen this kind of a situation before, when the war started in Bosnia. After, a couple of months, the observers also started switching off. And even 20 years ago, Stan Cohen, he's unfortunately deceased, sociologist from LSE, wrote a book, States of Denial, where he analyzes kind of political situations where people stop paying attention or started even denying, the horrors around them. But I want to move in my current work also to the new social media. To see how they are influencing this switching off. We have seen, with such a info pandemic, we can see, on the one hand, the steering of passions that are happening with the new social media, but on the other hand, we also have the tunnel vision. And, of course, now also some people who really don't want to have anything to do with the social media because of the problems that are related to it, from the big data, easy manipulation, being targeted constantly for advertising, or even specific political belief. So how can an individual survive in this climate? I would say the climate, which actually, when we are talking about climate, is becoming more and more dangerous. We are truly living on the cusp of probably one organization of society because of climate change, possible new pandemics, economic crisis, and all the crises related to neoliberalism. We can imagine, radical changes in our civilization. How does our psyche cope with this situation? And we have, of course, also seen a rise of phenomena like burnout, which is very much a phenomenon linked to neoliberalism. The idea which I worked on in my book, Tyranny of Choice, the idea that, the ideology is constantly, calling you to be the master of your life, to be in charge of your choices. And of course, the underside is the feeling of guilt, the feeling of inadequacy, anxiety, which are, I think, contributing to these new feelings of burnout, which is not related to being exhausted, tired from really physically maybe working too hard, but is this emotional feeling, which is a kind of a new type of a depression, which we observe pretty much everywhere around us.
Absolutely. No, and that's such an important topic and point. How do we live right now and stay engaged, but also take care of ourselves in that way as well?
Yes, which is difficult, when the situation is so negative around you. Quite often, we also have a situation of people embracing magical thinking, or religions, or various type of reasoning that comes from some obscure cults. I have been studying a little bit the new science of collapsology, which is sort of looking at the previous civilizations, why they collapsed, which mechanisms sort of brought to the end of the civilizations. Some civilizations sort of collapsed after 300 something years. This was analyzed by quite a lot of archaeologists. But, the psychological issues, of course, are more difficult to analyze now, the past situations. However, the ideas are that a certain kind of a collapse or a radical change in the civilization happens after, some major sort of like changes in the climate or illnesses, which then contribute to the kind of the social collapse and the loss of population, the loss of identity, also the loss of identification with the leaders. The leaders often try to contain unrest, but they cannot contain it constantly, which is why quite a lot of aggression and violence might be the next step. But for me, what is interesting are those moments of new beliefs when we are under a threat, let's say physical, from the environment, new illness or whatever. These new beliefs emerge with vengeance and quite a passion for religious thinking. And I think we have seen that in the time of the pandemics. I wrote a little book in Slovenian language, Homo homini virus. The idea was, how did the virus change us as humans and our intersubjective relationships? And, for me, it was interesting to see this denial of the virus at the beginning. And also, in some way, we can say we are living now in the fourth phase of the logic of denial. This was interestingly analyzed in the 70s by a French historian, Jean Delimot, who looked in the cases of medieval plague and other pandemics after that, and he saw the kind of four phases, where the first phase is denial, the second phase is searching for culprits, the third phase is living with the pandemic, somehow trying to protect yourself. And then the fourth phase is denial again. Often people start, partying as if nothing is happening. Or, at the time of the Spanish flu, in the last century, in 2019, when there was still a lot of infection, they had one of the biggest festivals in Rio de Janeiro. Party as much as you can. Of course, we have seen similar logics at work also in the HIV epidemics, where, kind of the last phase was, people didn't care, or even sometimes intentionally got infected or played a kind of a Russian roulette with the virus.
Yeah, absolutely. I left Sweden for the first time since COVID started last month, and did my first flight. And I was really surprised, actually. There's no masks in the airport, no masks on the plane. Like, it was like as if nothing had happened. And felt like I was the only one there with a mask. Yeah, it's really amazing to me. I wish there would just be, couldn't we be somewhere in the middle where we're not completely locking down, but we're also not completely in denial, Yes,
I observed that, especially flying from Britain, suddenly when the masks were not obligatory, people thought as if it is over, as if at that time they kind of obeyed the authorities who said now masks are not obligatory, although before they were, rightly skeptical about the authorities, because we have seen in many countries, especially UK, that authorities who passed the law often did not obey them themselves, let's say the lockdown laws.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we talk a little bit about your book, A Passion for Ignorance, as well? I mean, all of your books are so fantastic, and I'd love to go through them a bit more for listeners.
Thank you.
So what brought you to write? Well, actually, maybe let's start with the tyranny of choice, because they all feel like they flow one into another very in a way that makes sense, going from perversions of love and hate to anxiety to the tyranny of choice to a passion for ignorance, and now on apathy. It feels like there's definitely kind of an evolution here.
Yeah, it is. I guess we are sort of circulating usually as authors around some issues which sort of bother us. And with all these books, I was posing, various types of questions which relate to the changes in subjectivity. I have always been interested in how ideology changes people, which is why in my first book, The Spoils of Freedom, I was analyzing the time of the collapse of socialism, that kind of embracement of capitalism that happened in the post-socialist world, and also the ideological changes. People were molded differently in the former Yugoslavia. Also, the types of identifications that were encouraged were different. And I feel that today we are living in times where it is very important to see the new changes which we are having again. We are living in a situation with a lot of new technology, and also we are living in really the times of changed relationships, intersubjective relationships, and especially relationships towards authorities. Also, we have a situation where we have a kind of a growing disbelief, where it is the authorities who often encourage a certain kind of a disbelief or very much thrive on it. If we take President Vladimir Putin, his strength in some way comes from people not believing anyone anymore in Russia. I remember at the start of the war in Ukraine, where there was a TV presenter, her name was Osianikova, who unfolded a poster showing for a brief moment, her opposition to war on national television. There was immediately after this event a questioning on the Russian social media whether the event was truth. Is this fake? Is it real? Was this actually, someone opposing the war? Or, was it maybe the government behind her, sort of like doing this kind of a stunt and then not punishing the person much, so that they kind of show that they are not as punitive as people have the expectancies that they are, or, that there was sort of like fear that they are. So we can see that this disbelief somehow, I would say, encourages people to be in a permanent state of doubt, which, we who work in the field of psychoanalysis know the importance of doubt. The people who lack doubt might easily have the structure of psychosis, even an untriggered psychosis. But when doubt is encouraged from the position of power, it really helps authoritarian leaders in particular to stay in power, because people start disbelieving also, I would say, science, which we are seeing with the pandemic and also with climate change even more. And of course we have seen in the past so-called merchants of doubt at the time of sort of the debates about the danger of smoking. For example, there was a whole industry on the side of the tobacco producers, sellers, which were sort of trying to incite doubt. But I would say that doubt is now very much kind of incited from the highest echelons of authoritarian power. Of course, we should not be so pessimistic in saying that people do not trust anything, because there is also a paradoxical situation that we actually trust a lot, but we trust anonymous people. So when we are reading reviews online, we might trust on TripAdvisor or Google Maps, people writing something on restaurants or hotels or whatever we are choosing, and we trust them quite often, although we know that there might be manipulation behind. Some reviews might not be actually humans, but bots, or, but here we want, I would say, still a certain kind of, let's say, certainty. So I'm not saying that there is a total distrust, but there is quite a lot of confusion in whom to trust and whom to not. And of course, we have seen now for some decades a change in the authorities, how authorities do not necessarily act as classical authorities, and people do not identify also in the way we are raising children, or in the way the communities are organized. We see a certain kind of a change in the structures of authorities, like an influencer today without any serious education might be very much an authority. What I'm also interested is the steering of passion that is happening in the online world. So I finish my book, Passion for Ignorance, with this really challenging question, which is why are people who are very active in the online world, for example, sharing conspiracy theories or fake news in which they do not believe themselves. And I think that this is a quite crucial phenomena, because when I was questioning what do you gain when you are spreading news that you are not believing in, I needed to recognize actually two emotional gains, which I think from psychoanalytic point of view would be important to look into further. And of course, the first gain is recognition from your group, getting likes, having your post shared, gives you a certain emotional recognition, which people are craving, which shows that people, however, didn't change that much. This question of who am I for others? What do I want? How do others see me? Which psychoanalysis has been analyzing in depth, is still present. But now, likes online are a proof for your temporary proof for your identity or recognition, approval. And the second approval that people might seek is the pain in the other, stroking pain, pushing someone to respond with anger gives another type of a recognition, which is on the rise. I think that this kind of an aggression, especially in the online world, which is also easier to perform because we are not in a direct contact when people are shouting on each other in the online world or abusing each other. There is this distance where you can easily sort of forget that you are dealing with an actual human person who has feelings. You do not observe the feelings immediately, but from the reaction, you nonetheless get certain kind of recognition you are craving.
No, those are great points, that there's so many different directions we could go from here. One thing that's interesting, as you're pointing out, people that are kind of peddling these untruths that they themselves don't believe. And recently, at least one of these people has gone to court in the U.S. and actually was found guilty and has to pay to the victims of his slander. And I wonder about that. I mean, I hope to see more of that, but I wonder what you think about that, because it feels like it's been years and years and years of people just blatantly lying and spreading these untruths with no accountability whatsoever. And I wonder if there might be some sort of shift where people will be held accountable, and how that could be even possible legally.
Yes, and there is a very interesting new legal case coming in the United States, which involves Fox News, because they have been spreading disinformation about Trump's election loss, and now the company which is involved in the I think making of the voting machines or managing of this, they are suing the corporation for this, for the lies. They were also spreading about the fault in the voting system itself. Now the question now is, in a way, whether the company, Fox News in this case, is responsible for spreading the news. Who is, in a way, I would say, the owner of the news. In some arguments that the lawyers for Fox News are using, this is not yet, coming, the case is not yet tried, but the kind of debates that are happening now in the preparation for the trial are about the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, and one of quite absurd interpretation is that, let's say, if you are a television company and you are sort of spreading fake news or lies through the mouth of someone else, you might not be responsible. This is like one of the arguments that Fox News is trying to use, that in their television, if there are people, let's say politicians or other public personalities who are, let's say, saying or who were saying that, there was election fraud, although they were spreading actually this news continuously, they try to claim that they are not liable because of the First Amendment, which pertains to that individual person, uttering those statements.
And of course, Fox News has gotten away with this so long, saying they're news entertainment, not real news,
Exactly. And that, mixing of entertainment and news, I think it's really contributing to quite a lot of the problem of misinformation. For me, misinformation in regards to the vaccination was incredible, very painful to watch. And I think that we can imagine in the near future very similar type of misinformations related to climate change, which is becoming really one of the most important global problems.
No, absolutely. And making these things like political issues and points of political debate instead of just like, this is happening, this is the scientific reality, how are we going to address it,
Yeah.
I think that's why I think when I saw everyone in the airports, and was like, everyone's in COVID denial, I think I had a bit of an existential crisis, because it just was like a microcosm of the bigger picture of the climate crisis denial, and how like everyone seems to be just trying to kind of continue to go about their day and do the things they enjoy and go on vacation and visit people. I traveled for a wedding, it's like, okay, let's do the things we do in our lives. But then there's this like looming, existential threat that's, I think, much more present and closer than everyone seems to want to admit.
Yeah, we also had that, terrible summer in Slovenia, extreme temperatures, drought. Similarly in the UK, when I was in UK, the grass is yellow. It's real change, even a visual change. And we also, near the coast, had towns which were sort of starting to lack water, as we have seen in Spain. So things are really changing rapidly in regard to the weather. And now, just yesterday, we had like a tornado in Ljubljana, which is like the first time. And,
wow.
70 roofs were taken off, which is incredible. Just for a very short time, there was sort of like a vortex in the air of strong winds, which were sort of up to 100 kilometers. And, it was a shock because, some people got injured, trees were falling. No, this is a city which did not experience this kind of weather. So I'm very skeptical about how we will cope physically and psychologically with what is to come, because we can imagine, conflicts inside the states, for food, for, living conditions, also new migration. And whenever this kind of catastrophic situations happen, they open the door to populist leaders who are often, opening kind of false hopes, giving, sort of like kind of fantasies about how they will solve the situation, finding culprits, usually in the minorities or migrants. And my fear is that democracy is really on the decline. There is an interesting study actually coming from Sweden, which has analyzed, the decline of democracy around the world, where, today almost 3/4 of countries around the world are run by, sort of authoritarian or authoritarian leaders.
No, absolutely. I mean, that's even happening in Sweden right now. There's an election coming coming up in September. It's the first election I will be able to vote in. But the same thing has happened. You know, there's a war and people have to flee, and we welcome them because that's what you do. It's the international law. Then there's this backlash from people and this populist party, you know, is gaining power. And, you know, just, yeah, I'm voting, hoping to keep them out of power, basically, because it's a very bad road. It doesn't go anywhere good. And it's just a reaction. People are being reactionary instead of looking at the big picture, you know?
Yeah, that's happening in a lot of countries around Europe, and it can get worse in the winter when we will be facing, you know, really a serious crisis, you know, with energy, heating, the costs of living.
Yeah, the electricity is going to be really expensive this year as it was last year. It's going to be even worse, and we can expect more of that. Like you said, there's going to be ongoing wars. It's going to be more and more migration. These natural disasters. I mean, I think about this all the time because, and also the underreporting of everything. Because as much as we see everything on the news so much, and people feel overwhelmed, there's only a fragment of what's happening is reported. Like I follow. In order to get news from the US, I follow a lawyer who sends out a newsletter every Sunday because she actually like writes statistics about what's going on, and there's none of this like advertising and entertainment news factor. And she reports the number of mass shootings in the US every week. And I mean, this last week there was like 25 or 20 something shootings, mass shootings. And, you know, I post these regularly just to try to keep people aware of this issue. And, you know, a lot of people say, I live in that town or I live in that city, and I didn't even hear anything about that on the local news. You know, it's not even making news.
Yeah, but, you know, newspapers have been on decline. Also, the respect for serious work of journalists, you know, has been in decline also from publishing houses themselves. You know, the kind of profession of journalists has lost respect some time ago with cutting costs also, you know, and of course this infotainment, and of course with the parallels world now of the social media for the serious kind of news companies, it's very hard to kind of keep the pace and, you know, to keep being afloat.
Yeah, especially when these things are posted immediately, and then I see so often, you know, one source posts something, and then everyone's kind of referencing that, and it hasn't been researched. It's just like someone found this thing out, they posted it, and then it's all over the place, you know, rather than like serious journalism where they really get to what's going on at the root of the issue.
Yeah, I agree. And with my study on people closing down, I've seen that even very intelligent people in this kind of a cacophony of voices do not want to be disturbed anymore, and maybe follow just, you know, a few sources, as you mentioned, you know, some trustworthy bloggers, or, you know, just very limited news. I see this in authoritarian countries where a lot of my friends can survive only in such a way that actually they stop following news at all, the official news, which is, you know, full of misinformation or kind of glorification of the authoritarian leader in charge. And, you know, they are living in their bubbles, trying to somehow keep their sanity, I would say, and being able to focus on whatever they are doing.
Yeah, it's a challenge. And I remember what else I was going to say is sometimes people look for news that just validates what they already believe. So as soon as they find any source that's like, oh yeah, see, that's what I think too, then it ends there, you know?
Yeah, because we live in information bubble where, you know, we just need to kind of have that kind of a confirmation, which is why it's interesting to observe research which is trying to break those bubbles. You know, when people are, you know, getting news from another camp, if they're open to it, their opinions might slightly change, or they might be a little bit more open, more tolerant to other points of view. So I think that the biggest questions will be in the future, really, who controls this kind of a world of information? We are leaving it in the hands of a couple of big private companies, Google, Facebook, and those big companies are in charge of information, are in charge of the algorithms, which are secret, are in charge of the big data, which they are often selling or using for advertising purposes. Or we have seen with the Cambridge Analytica, the big data can be used to manipulate people's political opinions. So I think that here a global action is really needed to change this functioning of the news in the new social media. But I don't see much, let's say, energy or kind of a strategy globally, to prevent the big companies to continue profit from the data, from the people who are very much relying on their services.
Absolutely. It reminds me of the era of the monopolies from like the Industrial Revolution, and that those had to be broken up. And it's like so few people control the kind of information highway that's going out globally and is affecting billions of people, and people's thinking. And those few people are all kind of the same kind of person. It's like a very very small segment of the population has a huge influence on what everybody else is consuming. That's very disturbing.
And what also bothers me is this structural ignorance, which is embedded now in the way information are delivered. For example, some in-depth information might be hard to come, is behind a paywall. Even scientific research, is sometimes hard to be accessed. Scientists are writing scientific articles for free, but it's very expensive to read them. One needs to pay for access to scientific journals, which is why we are living in the kind of knowledge-based society, presumably, but it is better to say that we are living in an ignorance-based society where trademarks, copyrights, paywalls are actually limiting people's access to important new knowledge, especially, let's say, I would say, technical and scientific knowledge.
Yeah, and what a shame that is, where we have this plethora of information and there's ways for everyone to be able to access it that you can imagine if there was like this huge online library, like database that people could just access and read these articles for free, like a public library. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, some scientists are trying to make this kind of pools of knowledge so that scientists in other countries might have access to it. But I think it's not enough.
Yeah, we need a big overhaul, and how to organize that overhaul, like you said, globally. Like there really needs, and it's the same thing with the climate crisis. I mean, when I was traveling before the pandemic started, I remember seeing like traveling through like more countrysides of countries and not the kind of main tourist areas where people would go, and seeing so much plastic garbage and like piles of trash, and this is such a same thing. The issue is even greater than we realized with like pollution and and how I really felt like when I would see all of that, we really need like a concerted effort together, like globally, where nations like really like step up and we start taking care of this, like literally just like step by step cleaning things up.
Yeah, and that's why some political scientists are questioning whether we need some enlightened form of populism on the side of sort of like climate change battle, how to kind of mobilize people, because Extinction Rebellion group, for example, Greta Thunberg, they had some influence nonetheless, although not the influence to the highest echelons of power, but nonetheless in mobilizing people. So taking populism outside of the hands of the authoritarian leaders, reinterpreting it into sort of like fighting for democracy and climate change is one way, one path that some political scientists are kind of thinking through. Because as we know from past studies on populism, especially by Ernesto Laclau, Chantal Mouffe, populism is not necessarily linked to the right wing. It can be co-opted by the left-leaning politicians. But of course, there is a battle in society of, how populism works, or who, sort of interprets the causes in a populist way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. How do we mobilize instead of waiting for the powers that be to do something about it? How do we mobilize ourselves?
Yeah, in Slovenia, we had a lot of mobilizations the last 2 years because we had an authoritarian-leaning previous government. Happily, there was a change in government at the start of this year, but it was a government which was sort of leaning in the direction of Viktor Orban, the Hungarian autocrat, and we had like 2 years of mobilizations on the streets every Friday, bicycling of people, like hundreds, thousands of people sometimes protesting the government by, going on the bikes, because at the time of the lockdowns, exercise was allowed, but protests were not. However, you can do a protest biking around the city. And, this mobilization that happened, which really relied on many NGOs, a lot of youth organizations, at the end, gave us the results, which is a change of government. But it was important to mobilize people, on all fronts of life. The first mobilization started around a referendum over clean water, where happily, people were mobilized because they felt that it is an issue that touches them. There were some attempts to change legislation about water, which would allow private companies more access, also sort of building closer to the seashore or river shores. And, people opposed it because they felt strongly against such legislation. And, happily, the similar type of mobilization continued with the general elections, where, people came out voting in huge numbers, which did not happen before in the previous elections. So the feeling of threat to democracy, happily at this moment, was enough. But of course, passivity might come again. And with us, sometimes people don't go to voting simply because it's a sunny Sunday and they prefer, to go and have a picnic in the nature.
No, totally. That totally happened. I mean, I basically been voting since the 2000 election with Bush v. Gore. And I recently saw that Fox News has been around for 25 years. So just before then, they must have started in 97, I guess then. So they've always been around for the elections I've been voting in. And yeah, it was like, it was so important to vote then. And I was in Florida, and, Bush's brother, Jeb Bush, was the governor of Florida. And then it just happened to have like all of these, ballots that they couldn't find in the state that I was in, etc. And then we ended up with Bush, and people came out to try for the second election, but then 9/11 had happened, and people got really patriotic populist, and he won that too, and and then we got Obama in there, and I really feel like the people who were around for Obama but not for the Bush era, things got like, people got much more passive and like happy and complacent, and like, see, America is doing better, like, look at us. And then now we ended up with this
I like to use those election problems from Florida when I'm teaching some sort of basic psychoanalytic ideas of structure, the structure of neurosis, structure of psychosis, and structure of perversion, because I remember those debates, which were about the machines, whether the machines were faulty or not, the voting machines. You probably remember that suddenly we learned that the term chat, a little round thing that, you punch and should kind of fall out, when you're voting, when the voting machine works properly. And then you had two problems, the hanging chat and the pregnant chat. So when the machine only kind of touched the ballot, but did not fully, punch it, so the chat did not fall out. And I like to kind of use that as an example, when you have a properly voting machine, you have a structure of neurosis. The lack emerges, the sort of like the structural lack in the subjectivity when you don't have this kind of a fully functioning, let's say, symbolic law, the prohibition of incest, then you might have a hanging chat, like kind of a structure of perversion, where then the subject tries to sort of complete, often in a kind of a fantasy way, castration, to kind of detach that chat, of course, unsuccessfully. And then, you have the pregnant chat with the structure of psychosis, where the machine kind of operated, language, however, not fully. So the lack, the symbolic castration did not become fully operative.
Oh my God, I love that. That's amazing.
Yeah, so your election problems give me some material to work on in the psychoanalytic domain.
No, that's amazing. And I remember that election and all those problems very well. And I also remember on election night, because I was 23, and I also remember on election night that Fox News announced first that Bush had won. And I remember, even though I wasn't very worldly at the time, I remember going, nobody else has announced that. And then it's like, as soon as they announced it, it was like everyone started announcing it. And even then I felt like, this is very strange. How's this working? And maybe that's what got me interested in psychoanalysis. No, that was definitely my mother, but
Yes.
Well, it's so nice talking to you. Is there anything that you wanted to be mentioned that we didn't get to yet? Was there anything else coming up, or any events or anything that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, okay. One of the projects that I'm working on at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law in Slovenia, where I'm working, is a research on whom to save at the time of the pandemic. So we are doing a research on triage and COVID-19. And this has been an interesting study because it involves interesting philosophical analysis of what underpins ethical decisions nowadays. The situation of pandemics forced us to start thinking of which criteria the countries will embrace in case of shortage of beds in intensive care units, shortage of ventilators, or even we were thinking shortage of vaccines or drugs for COVID. And interestingly, countries adopted quite different kind of policy. Some countries wanted to embrace total egalitarianism. However, egalitarianism might rely on who comes first. First comes first gets the treatment, but people might live far away. People might not have the car or other possibilities to even come to the hospitals. So egalitarian approach is problematic, which is why quite a lot of countries started adopting more of a utilitarian approach, where there are kind of reasoning that maybe we should prioritize saving many lives, or the question becomes there also, how do you make a hierarchy, let's say, between which life is valuable, which isn't? So quite a lot of painful issues sort of came into this reasoning. And when the countries tried to write out, the kind of the rules, who will be given priority treatment in case of the lack of, let's say, beds in the hospital or so on. An important issue also emerged between, ex ante and ex post triage. Many times it is, let's say, for doctors easier to decide when two people are, competing for the same bed and have, let's say, similar types of, let's say, health problems. they might, let's say, decide that one gets the bed, one doesn't, more easily than if some person is already, let's say, occupying the bed, but has fewer chances to survive, and then comes someone who would have better chances to survive, and which means that you would need to disconnect the first person and give the option to the second person. So this kind of choices, tragic choices, were something that we looked upon with my team at the Institute. We are still working on it, and we are writing an English book about this ethical, legal, and medical dilemmas in regard to triage in the times of the pandemic, because we can imagine that first, this pandemic is not yet over, but also the next ones are about to happen. And for doctors and other personnel in the hospitals, it is incredibly stressful, anxiety-provoking, guilt-ridden to deal with these questions if there are no guidances, also if there is no help to them making the decision. And some countries, Germany, for example, is also proposing that with this kind of life-death decisions, there should be a broader consensus, which means that maybe in the team which will be, making the decision at the end, there should be someone who is not a doctor, maybe an ethicist or a nurse, at least a nurse, I would say, or a social worker or someone, so that you have at least 6 eyes, they say, so 3 people, but making the decision, which kind of alleviates the feeling of anxiety and guilt of, let's say, the doctor who is treating the patient.
Wow, that's very intense and important work. I'm so glad you're doing that. And people, these are the things that people need to keep in mind were happening in the beginning of the pandemic. And like you said, this pandemic is a symptom of the greater climate issues, and it's just going to keep happening. So we need to, figure out how we're going to continue to deal with these things.
And stop being in denial, which we have been already before this pandemic, because there was quite a lot of research in the last decade, about the impending pandemics, which, the researchers analyzed when they were looking at the changes in habitat, the danger of sort of the jump of the virus from wild animals to domestic animals or humans, because of the exploitation that is happening in many parts of the world of nature, the monocultures, also the mining industry. All this are sort of coming into the habitat where, we are meeting much more of the, wild animals than before, where this kind of a virus transmission can happen. And of course, with climate change and continuation of all the exploitation that neoliberalism embraces, all the inequalities around the world, I think we can definitely expect a repetition of pandemic that we lived through, and which unfortunately, of course, is not yet even finished.